Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles show that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly podcast in which we talk about all things Beatles, anything about the past, anything about the present, any part of their history or their music we cover here on this show. All things are up for grabs on this program. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the co-hosts of this program, also known from my other Beatles show, the syndicated show called Every Little Thing, being joined by my regular co-hosts of the show, the man who writes for Beatles Examiner, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And one of the writers for Beatle Fan magazine, who's been with them since the very beginning, since the inception of Beatle Fan, that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And we also have our resident musicologist and freelance writer who also writes for Beatle Fan, that being Allan Kozinn. Hi, Allan.
Hi again. Hello, everyone.
On the show this time, we have a special guest with us on the phone, and that's Laurence Juber. Laurence is known to Paul McCartney fans around the world and Beatle fans for being the last lead guitarist in Wings, and he played on the Back to the Egg album, was part of the 1979 UK tour. He was on the live hit for Coming Up, and he was basically with Paul for the good part of 3 to 4 years with Wings. And he's got a brand new CD out, and it's called Fingerboard Road, and we're going to be talking about his new album and also his time with Paul. So let's welcome Laurence Juber to Things We Said Today. Hi, Laurence.
Hi there. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Let's start the conversation by talking about the new album, which, as I said, is called Fingerboard Road. The album has 13 songs on it. There's 3 originals, and there's 10 covers. So I want to start by asking you the question, how do you normally pick the songs that you cover on your albums? Are they personal favorite songs, or are they songs where you can hear yourself bring an interesting arrangement to the song, or both?
Well, both, for certain. And also, with input from my wife, Hope, who has to listen to me working out the arrangements of these things. and is also my producer, my co-producer on the project. So she'll chime in with suggestions. And sometimes I'll just sit down, pick up the guitar and start playing something that will just kind of come from somewhere deep in my memory, and it'll turn into an arrangement. Other times I'll specifically pinpoint a song because there's some kind of resonance. I mean, for example, I did Go Now on this album, which when I played it with Denny Lane on a TV show in London in 1977 was functionally my audition piece for Wings. It's kind of, there are different kinds of resonances that happen. I mean, I have, I did Angela, which is better known as the theme from Taxi, which is a Bob James tune. And that's just this kind of like almost proto-smooth jazz, but in the days when they were actually kind of still using pretty adventurous harmony. And that and Steely Dan's Peg both have a very kind of mid-70s kind of vibe about them that is really kind of part of my musical background, where at that period, I mean, pre-Wings, I was a studio musician. I was listening to a lot of kind of West and New York fusion type stuff, big fan of Weather Report, Return to Forever, music like that. And that particular kind of harmonic vocabulary and melodic sensibility really kind of resonates with me. And so there's a nice challenge in making a guitar arrangement that's going to be satisfying in that particular genre.
Right. Okay. We're going to do this like a round table. So each of the guys will ask you a question. Who wants to go next?
I can.
All right, Al.
Hi, LJ. How are you tonight?
Oh, I'm a little fried. I was at Abbey Road on the River.
You just came back from Abbey Road on the River. That's right. That's right. How was
that? It was fun, and just by pure coincidence, that yesterday was this 36th anniversary release of Back to the Egg.
Right.
And I happened to be on stage with Steve Holley singing some Wings songs from Back to the Egg. So it was kind of a fortuitous occurrence there. And we had Phil Lindsay, who's a great sax player who actually played on Jet. He played baritone sax on Jet. He played the sax on Al Stewart's hits, Year of the Cat and Time Passages, on So I co-opted him to play on Rockestra. So we wasn't exactly the grand rock orchestra, but it was nice having a sax on that tune.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned, you just mentioned playing Go Now with Denny in 1977, how would you compare doing that song that way in 1977 to what did you bring to that song on this new album?
Well, what I try and do when I'm doing a solo arrangement is to be true to the spirit of the record, typically true to the spirit of the record. Now, of course, my interpretation of it draws more on having played it with Denny and with Wings than the Moody Blues original.
Sure.
So there's an extra dimension that comes into that. But really, it's just, I think for me, these arrangements often are just the art of the possible. It's finding that place in the musical, where that nexus of the music, the fingerboard, the guitaristic sensibility, and just what's physically possible on the instrument to articulate something that really communicates the essence of the song, but also gives me, in this case, and in fact for the whole album, a little bit of room to stretch out. There's a more improvisational aspect to this album, perhaps, than some of my previous ones. In fact, most of my previous ones.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I took some liberties. There's room to play some solos, but I'm still always trying to find the voice. I'm trying to find the way in where that melody sits. And to put everything else around it, put the bass in there, get that, especially with Go Now, because it's a waltz, it's in 3/time, which is kind of unusual for a rock song.
Yeah.
And even though it has its R&B roots, so that kind of thing just was kind of a nice challenge because it has a lilt to it, but it's not lyrically it's not kind of a happy song. It's actually a very sad, moving kind of song, but it's in waltz time and it's in a major key. So there's this interesting interplay between the emotion of the song and the natural kind of tendency to make it happy. So that's part of the challenge is to kind of keep that bluesiness in there and try and catch the way that Denny sings that opening phrase, that we've already said, and to get just enough of a bend in there to really make it cry. And that's the kind of stuff that I just try and kind of really personalize it and guitarize it at the same time.
Exactly.
I just want to say it's Allan Kozinn. I just want to say, speaking as a guitarist, that the playing on here is really stunning, and in particular, the live cut at the end, love at first sight, really beautiful. But the track I wanted to ask you about actually is the first one, Without a Net, which is, I guess, at least part of incidental music that you wrote for a play that your wife has written, and is going to be, I guess, repeated in June in LA, I think.
Yes.
And I think part of the thing about that play is that although it's got a script, there's some improvisatory aspects to it as well. Is that the case?
Yes, it's a scripted play that's set in an improv workshop. So there's a teacher and 10 participants, and in the course of the play, you learn about the characters and their interplay. But when they do an improvisation exercise, it's most of the time that's actually improvised. So it's never the same way twice. That each time you see the play, the improvisations are different. But the improvisations, unlike a normal improv show where you might have a group like the Groundlings or Second City. The famous improv groups who will, create a scenario and improvise within that. We have in this play that you have the scenario, but the improvisations are done from the perspective of the characters, and in the course of the improv, there are certain things that they have to accomplish in order to satisfy plot points that cover the broader range of the script.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular piece that I wrote is the kind of the theme song. It's the introductory piece of music, and it was so it was kind of commissioned. I mean, I was producing the show, and I am producing the show for this run also. So it was something that I wanted to give Hope something that would kind of establish a certain kind of tone, and because the show has a certain amount of risk to it, that what I wrote kind of puts me on the edge of being able to improvise and being able to kind of get out of the improvisation and back into the kind of quote scripted or the composed part of it, and be able to really kind of have that kind of quality that the title Without Annette, which actually refers to a woman's name, Annette, but it also is a play on words because it's like when you improvise, you're working without Annette, without support. And I've learned a lot over the years from working in theater, and at one point, Hope and I both took some improv classes at the Groundlings, and she's taken a lot more improv than I have, but I just took a few classes. But I learned a lot about music improvisation from working in that kind of environment and from watching actors improvise. And in the course of the play, at the end of the play, the class do an actual improv show, and I'm involved in that. So when they're improvising a scene, I may be improvising underscore or stings to go along with it. So there's this interesting interactivity, and I love the ability to be able to stretch out away from this pure fingerstyle guitar kind of the calculus and the algebra and the geometry of the whole thing, which is can be very regimented, because in what I do in doing my arrangements, especially when I'm doing classic songs like Harold Arlen songs, or in the case of the new album Georgia on My Mind, or doing Beatles songs where there are very, very specific and very, very calculated ways of getting around the arrangement and the performance of it. I like the fact that in this context I can play a lot looser, and I'm not restricted in the same way. And that's also been fed into by, over the last few years, playing more electric guitar. I've been getting back into that, and what that does, because as a teenager, I was my goals were to be a studio guitar player, an articulate bluesy rock lead guitar player, and a fingerstyle guitar player, all on kind of parallel but interrelated tracks. And it was the lead guitar thing that got me into Wings, that and the versatility. But the fingerstyle guitar thing is really kind of what got me post Wings into actually developing an artistic voice. And over the course of the last few years, my last album, Under an Indigo Sky, had a certain amount of improvisation in it, but I've gone that much further with this new album, and it seemed appropriate to put Without Annette as the first track, because it kind of just set up a particular feeling and a particular tone, and the sense that there were some risks being taken.
I was going to ask you, in fact, about electric guitar, because the albums are primarily acoustic, well, pretty much entirely acoustic, and it is so different from what you did in Wings, and it's a different type of playing. But I know that as a studio guitarist, you must have done an awful lot of both. And I was wondering if you had in any way sort of missed the electric guitar side of your career.
I've certainly missed it in terms of the performance aspect, because it's just so much fun to get up on stage with a great rhythm section and other guitar players or keyboard players or horn players, and just have that kind of group consciousness. I've been in the studio. I've done quite a lot of it, and I've done now I produced 4 albums for Al Stewart, his last 4 studio albums, of which 3 of those are pretty heavily electric guitar oriented. The first one was almost exclusively acoustic. but there's been a fair amount of electric guitar in there, and of course, over the years playing on TV shows like Home Improvement and Roseanne and stuff like that, where the electric guitar was a fairly prominent voice. Although on Home Improvement there was also 12-string acoustic was a voice in that. But I get to do it to some extent, and I really enjoy that. But it sure is a lot easier to be just going out and gigging as a solo. I mean, the economics of it make a lot more sense. But it's like being at Abbey Road on the River and playing an electric set or a Beatle Fest, or I mean, I get to do that stuff often enough that I still kind of keep it up. And we have backyard jams at home, and I'll go out and do jams around the LA area. I mean, one of my favorite people to play with is Albert Lee, who was one of my heroes as a teenager, and it's just so cool to get up and get into this fiendish like electric guitar picking in the circumstance. And I'm very fortunate that I get to play with and share stages with some of the greatest players. So one is always learning. I'm always learning, and it's great to have that kind of breadth of experience.
Okay, so over to Steve.
Well, I was going to ask Laurence, the song that really kind of surprised me, but also delighted me was "Won't Get Fooled Again," because I'm a big Pete Townsend fan, and I've heard Pete's acoustic versions, but I'm wondering what inspired you to do that. It sounds wonderful.
Well, thank you. You can actually blame Martin Lewis for that. Because he called me up and said, I'm producing a tribute to Pete Townsend. Pete was getting the Tech Awards, which is kind of the music technology awards. They were giving him the Les Paul Award, which is kind of for notable musical stuff. And Pete, having been a pioneer in the 70s, a real pioneer of music technology in terms of using synths and early sequencers and all the stuff that drives songs like Baba O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again. Those really doing very, very adventurous stuff before anybody else really had kind of grasped the potential of that technology. And so Martin had asked me to make a contribution to this event that he was producing, and I chose to do Won't Get Fooled Again because I was going through my favorite Who songs and realized that the intro to Won't Get Fooled Again with that kind of synth obligato thing is something that I could emulate on acoustic guitar, but in the tuning that I use for a lot of stuff, which is DAD-GAD tuning. And so, which was really funny because the first time I played it, Pete was in the audience. And I think he was kind of baffled by how I managed to pull that off because I got a note from him afterwards. He was very enthusiastic about it. And it went over well. And I kept doing it in concert, and it just has become kind of a big concert piece for me. So I figured that, it was absolutely worth putting on the album. And it's always great fun to play. And I get to do some windmills and, but I think that part of, and this is not just true for that song, but it's true for a great deal of what I do, that I discovered some years ago that DAD-GAD tuning, D-A-D-G-A-D, is very, very useful for arranging pop and rock songs and standards for that matter. It does things that standard tuning doesn't do and allows me to do stuff that would more naturally come to a piano player or to somebody that was arranging for a bigger ensemble in terms of the way in which the string to string relationships work, the way in which I can articulate melody and bass at the same time, and how all of that stuff fits together in a very satisfying guitaristic way that allows me to realize the kind of deeper complexity of these tunes and create something that actually is very performable too. And it just has become kind of part of my voice. And so to find an iconic tune like Won't Get Fooled Again and have it work in that context it's really kind of part of a big part of what motivates me to keep doing this and coming up with cool and interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laurence. Ken?
Yeah, I want to ask you about Dadgad in just a moment, but I also want to bring up the song Without You, because, certainly Beatle fans are aware that the band Badfinger originally did it, and of course Harry Nilsson had a huge hit with it. Which version were you most familiar with, and what made you decide to record that song?
I think I knew the Nilsson version more than the Badfinger version, because the Nilsson version was the hit, and one still hears it on the radio. But I did reference the Badfinger version. That one actually is the only tune on the album that is not in Dadgad. That's in C, G, D, G, A, D, which is a kind of a dropped version of Dadgad. The bottom two strings drop down. And it was, I think, it was really Hope's idea that would be one to do. I mean, but I readily concurred because it's just such a great song. And it's such a dark song, and the history of Badfinger, the guys that wrote it, and also of Harry Nilsson. I mean, it's so tragic, and so to be able to kind of dig into that emotional space with it was an interesting challenge. And guitaristically, I mean, I'm in that tuning, but I play it in the key of F, which was an interesting thing for me to do, because I'd never done an arrangement in F in that tuning. More typically, I've used it in the key of G, C, C minor. I recently did an arrangement of Alfie that's in B flat. But that tuning is kind of an interesting challenge, and that piece was a challenge. But I felt good about how it ended up. But I think it's just that whole kind of tragic underscore to it all.
Right. I mean, Badfinger was such an incredibly talented band, and they had so much incredibly bad luck. And and of course, we lost Harry Nilsson way too soon as well.
Oh yeah.
But talk about Dadgad. Is this? Can you tell something in the tone of the guitar when you play in that style? And talk more about, you was saying that it's more flexible when you're doing arrangements.
See, the originally Davy Graham, who is credited with developing it, British fingerstyle guitar player. A very revered player in the English folk scene, had developed it as a way of kind of using it as a drone tuning so he could jam with Moroccan musicians. And his most famous piece is Angie, which Paul Simon covered, which is actually in standard tuning. But there's a direct link from Davy Graham through to Jimmy Page using Dadgad. And like a Kashmir, for example, is in that tuning, which again relates to that Middle Eastern kind of vibe. But and Bert Jansch, John Remborn have used it. A lot of Celtic guitar players have used it because it has a very open kind of modal quality to it, because it's a suspended tuning. It doesn't tell you whether it's major or minor, because it's D-A-D, G-A-D, so it's like a D suspended chord if you just strum it open. But I got to a point after my second album, which would have been about 1993, where I was kind of being encouraged to explore altered tunings. And I had played with Dadgad a little bit as a teenager, but just kind of playing around with the droniness of it. And one day I was sitting in a hotel room in Portland, Oregon, and I just challenged myself to try and figure out what it was that I could use it for. And once I realized that I could just apply my regular musicianship to it and just get used to the notes being in different places, I then started to explore how the string to string relationships and the intervals and how things were accessible in ways that they weren't in standard tuning. For example, you have 3 D strings, you have 2 A strings. So octaves are very easy to accomplish in that tuning. But there's also, you have 2 adjacent scale tones. So you have a G and an A. So if you go to an adjacent string and then add, let's say, an F to that, you can play F, G, and A, 3 adjacent scale tones on adjacent strings, and that opens up all kinds of possibilities for the kinds of fingering patterns that allow notes to ring into each other, or chords where a minor chord and a suspended fourth would coexist, which opens up the vocabulary more, and becomes the way of approaching the guitar becomes more like what a piano player can do, because on a piano every note is accessible to you. On the guitar,
Right.
you have to kind of find those notes, and the same note might be available in 3-4 different places. In DAGGAD, it opens up different kinds of fingering possibilities, and somehow it just kind of falls very naturally into a place where pop songs just live, And I think the real moment for me was doing Strawberry Fields Forever. And I'd been working in DAGGAD at that point for about 5-6 years. But when I realized that tuning and Strawberry Fields Forever were just kind of made for each other on the guitar, it really kind of opened me up to even more possibilities with it. And I just figured, well, I'm going to stick with this as my other standard tuning. And it's really become a very useful tool. But it is a tool. And I'll readily go to standard tuning or some other tuning if it's appropriate. I'm not like DAGGAD monogamous like that. I use it probably for about half of what I do. But it helped bring out my voice. I think I'd already started to establish a voice, but that just, it took it to another level.
Very interesting. Okay. Go back to Al.
I can tell you firsthand, having seen you perform Strawberry Fields Forever a couple of times, it is jaw-dropping. It's so good.
Oh, thank you.
And also, I was very glad to hear you mention the kind of feel of tragedy that surrounds Without You. Even to the point of the fact that Mal Evans produced not Without You, but produced other tracks on the album that it comes from, the Badfinger album that it comes from, Straight Up, or No Dice, excuse me.
Yeah.
No Dice. But that I've always felt that there was this kind of feeling of just kind of a very sort of fatalistic feeling around that song.
Yeah.
And
I was interested to discover, I didn't know that Gary Wright played the piano part.
Neither did I, as a matter of fact.
Huh.
No, I never knew that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Now you mentioned the fact that you've recently gone back to playing electrically, and I saw you at the Fest for Beatles fans in Rye, New York, back in March, and saw you do Johnny Be Good. I believe it was Johnny Be Good, if I remember correctly. Yep. And
that's kind of one of my party pieces.
Okay, and I think it was because you were kind of vamping, because I think you guys were waiting for Mark Hudson to show up, as a matter of fact. But had you performed that in a while, or?
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's kind of a regular tune for me. The one that I had done earlier, I think it was on the Saturday. I sat in with Jeff Slate and his band Birds of Paradox, because Steve Holly was playing drums, and I've done an arrangement, a different kind of arrangement of Arrow Through Me that I sing, where I've taken it kind of more bluesy than Paul did it, because I always thought that was a really cool song, and it kind of had, to my ears, it always had potential other than the way that Paul did it.
Yeah.
And actually, I just found out, I had no idea that the R&B artist Erykah Badu had actually recorded a whole song using the groove of the actual Wings recording of Arrow Through Me, using the intro of it as a loop that she wrote the whole song to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, fascinating. And then there was some other rap guy had used the intro to Old Siamsa. It's interesting how Back to the Egg kind of crops up in these interesting contexts, you know.
Hmm.
But the fact is that Johnny Be Good for me was always one that I would do because I could remember the words. But I'm really starting to kind of push myself more. I'm like at Abbey Road on the River. I also did We're Open Tonight and Spin It On.
Oh, wow.
And I love Spin It On because it's just this really cool punk rockabilly piece.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of energy.
Yep.
Alan?
You recently did a video interview for Fretboard Journal. And one of the things that you mentioned was that during your Wings period, you were, to quote what you said, watching and learning and realizing how an artist like that functions. And I was wondering, how does an artist like that function?
Well, yeah, that's a very long conversation. I mean, basically, I had gone to London University and I had a degree in music, and I had, these 3-4 years of solid studio work under my belt, but I had never really just had the luxury of being able to watch somebody on that level, developing material, having the same kind of interaction that I was getting with Paul, and seeing how he would approach things. And like the very first session that I did was for a song called Same Time Next Year.
Mm-hmm.
And we recorded it, and that was my first session. Steve Holly and I, both of us, our first session with Wings, and we recorded it, and it was like, okay, well, now we're going to put strings on this. And it's like seeing that process at work, and then going up to Scotland, and we'd done that song, which was kind of a big movie type feeling to it, kind of very cinematic, even though I never got actually used in that movie because I think Marvin Hamlish ended up scoring it. But then the next thing we did was the song To You on Back to the Egg, which was, very edgy. And the range, I mean, going from doing some, very big kind of My Love type, cinematic McCartney song to doing this very edgy kind of punky rock thing was such a strong contrast. And then in the course of recording, like there was one day where Paul said, we're not going to work on the album today. I want to do some Rupert demos. And we spent a day demoing songs for, this proposed Rupert the Bear movie. And it was just how broad, in his case, how broad his palette was, and how easy it was for him to switch gears from one style to another. And because there was this kind of uber consciousness of this artistic consciousness that wasn't just driven by being in one genre, but by being an artist and a musician and a multi-instrumentalist and a producer, and being able to wear many hats, some of them at the same time. Mm-hmm. And being in the course of it, I mean, one would assume that there's a very strong ego at work there, which there is, but a very collaborative ego too. So it was, a head that wore many hats, but it never really felt like it was too big, as it were. Following through on the metaphor.
Yeah, I was wondering how collaborative that ego was. I mean, you were used to, as a session musician, being and certainly also as one who reads, being given a chart, and this is what you play, and this is when you play it, and that was really the job of being a session musician. But in a band like Wings, how much room did you have to create your own lead lines, or did he suggest more or less what he wanted? Did you feel free to bring your own ideas to the tracks?
There was a lot of freedom. I think that being a studio musician had trained me in coming up with guitar parts, because even though very often you're handed something that's written, there's also a certain amount of freedom to kind of invent the in-between licks or just find exactly the right rhythm groove or whatever. And with Wings, there was the freedom was there. I mean, there weren't that many occasions when Paul said, you have to play this. Now, there were certain times, for example, with the riff to Old Siam Sir, I mean, that was written into the song. or the basic kind of groove of Spin It On. But when it came to the solos, for example, I was given really a lot of leeway, and I was very happy to have that. And that really continued. I mean, there were only a few occasions where Paul said, I want you to play this. And that was, times when things had been written in. They were really part of the song. Like there's in Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, there's a little guitar lick that he said, this is what I want. Or, on Coming Up, this is the guitar lick that the whole thing is based on. And so, that's compositional rather than more kind of musical direction where there's that certain freedom to be able to inject your own personality. I think the area where I felt like I was pushing the envelope was more in terms of the live show, because Paul's not big on, kind of extended guitar solos. So I really had to kind of pick my moments and really try and kind of put my voice in there in my own way. So when we did Let It Be, for example, I wasn't trying to be George. I was trying to, bring my sensibility to the solo on that. But in the studio environment, I mean, I really felt that the freedom was there. And, and the reality is, if you didn't get it right, Paul could always pick up the guitar and do it himself.
Right. That's true. Okay, thanks. Steve?
Are you surprised that, just getting a little more general with Paul, Laurence, are you surprised he's still out, to use the phrase of the tour, out there? Are you surprised he's still going as hard as he is?
Not really, because I think he loves to perform. That I think he really, that's always, being on stage is just so much built into his DNA. And I think that, I mean, one could look at it that maybe there's a sense that, if not now, when? Because, if he stops doing it now, he's probably not going to do it again in 5 years. I mean, let's just keep going while the going's good. And he's got a big machine set up there. I mean, once you put that machine together, you want to keep it oiled. Otherwise, you have to start over. And it's not easy to put together a show of that scope, and to have to have such a tight band and such a tightly put together stage show with all of that rigging. I mean, I can't imagine how many man hours it takes to put together his staging.
Right.
And I think it's working. So why not? And it's not like he has, whereas in 1980 it was like, I got busted in Japan. Now, we don't want to take the kids out of school. I don't want to be, dealing with, immigration and all of that stuff. And he didn't travel for another nearly 10 years. Whereas over the years, he kind of gradually started to ramp it back up. And now, it's what he does. And I think it's great that he's doing it, and he's certainly satisfying his audiences. He puts on a great show, and there's no shortage of material. He's never going to run out of tunes to play live.
That's absolutely true. Ken?
Laurence, you were just talking about how, in your view, you looked at Wings as being a very collaborative type of effort. Do you separate the Wings period from post-Wings, Paul? Is it all? There are some people who think no matter what, it's Paul's music no matter what. And he still could be collaborative with all the people that he worked with on all of his solo albums anyway. So do you view the Wings period as being something that is separate from everything else that he did in his post-Beatles career? And why?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, because in my view, Wings was not Paul's band, it was Paul and Linda's band. And as much as, Linda made her contribution in some very specific ways that, I found her to be very much part of the rock and roll heart of the band. Because Paul can go in a very pop direction. And the reality is that, Wings' biggest hits in the 70s were pop hits. Whether it's, Listen to What the Man Said, Let Him In, My Love. This wasn't, the big hits weren't really the hard rock side of the band. But Linda kept things rocking from my perspective. And her voice was also a very integral part. Hers and Denny's and Paul's voices blending were very much that strong backing vocal sound that you identify with those hit records, just as much as, you know, the sound of the Bee Gees records or 10cc or those bands in the 70s that used a very strong vocal ensemble sound. And so, you know, she was very integral to it, even though she got a lot of criticism for her, you know, supposed lack of musicianship. She made up for it in other ways. And I think that by the time we got Back to the Egg, I think she was starting to disengage because, you know, James was a baby. She now had 4 kids. They'd done the big world tour thing. And then Paul getting busted, which, of course, I mean, came after the album. But it was a progression to the point where Wings really ceased to become that entity. And then Paul went on, you know, to be doing Paul records. And yes, Linda may have been involved, but it wasn't the same level of involvement as with Wings, where she was a constant presence. So I do find that there's a difference between those. But, you know, I can only ultimately speak from my own experience as far as that particular era, the Egg era. You know, I consider myself an egg man in that. That era was kind of what I describe in my book, Guitar with Wings. I describe it as the Indian summer of Wings. That it was kind of, Wings was ready to wind down, but we kind of like picked it up again, you know, putting some fresh blood in there. And Steve Holley being a very different kind of drummer. You know, my theory is that Paul tends to hire drummers who play more like him than like Ringo. You know, it's like,
wow.
You know, Joe English was not an English style drummer. Denny Seiwell was basically a New York jazz session player, but Steve Holley is a solid English backbeat kind of drummer and brought that kind of sensibility to Back to the Egg. Chris Thomas brought his sensibility to Back to the Egg, which is a very kind of a progressive, conceptual point of view, and he produced that album in between doing the Sex Pistols and the Pretenders, you know. So I think Back to the Egg kind of had its own life, and we, as a band, we were encouraged to think of ourselves as a band, and I think that we captured a certain kind of quality in that album that is a little different from the other Wing stuff. Which is not to be critical of the other Wing stuff, because, you know, both Jimmy and Henry, my predecessors, both did some fantastic work with the band. But I think that Back to the Egg kind of exists in a slightly different space, and I don't think it was necessarily fully appreciated at the time. But and the album that followed that, from Paul's perspective, as far as McCartney 2, was another one that was not really appreciated in its own time, but has been revisited, you know, because what McCartney 2 did was to really initiate a certain kind of sensibility that fed into the whole kind of electronic kind of mode of doing things. Whereas I think that what our era of Wings was, between Goodnight Tonight coming up, which were both, even though Goodnight Tonight was criticized as being, quote, a disco record because Columbia Records, you know, called the 12-inch a disco single. In reality, it was kind of more like a Latin dance rock record. And Coming Up was a rock dance record. And they were kind of a little ahead of the curve of what was going on in the early 80s in terms of the way in which rock and kind of club dance music converged. So there was, I think, some interesting angles that could be, you know, in terms of Beatlology, Wingsology, rock musicology. You can look at that era and kind of pull out some interesting angles on it. And I think the fact that you have people like Erykah Badu and you know, various rap people using loops from that album, because there was a certain kind of tone to it that was a little different from what had come before. And I think I'm going to have to wrap it up at this point, because I've got actually have to go to a rehearsal of the play that I'm producing, so I can take notes tonight.
Well, thanks for your perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's fascinating.
And,
Well, I'm happy to continue this at another time. I think that there's all kinds of nuances to all of this, and it's part of where I live in terms of being a trained musicologist myself and a guitarist and having the kind of experience that I do. It's the analytical aspect of it, looking at music and looking at how it functions in its historical space is a very is just part of my musical milieu, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, it has been fantastic having you here on the show. So, Laurence, thanks so much. We want to remind everybody the name of the CD is Fingerboard Road. Laurence, thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. And people can get to my website, laurencejuber.com. There's a link to my online store. There's a link to my email list. And I get out there and I do my gigs. So check my concert schedule, too.
All right.
Thank you very
Laurence,
much. All right.
Thank
cheers.
you, Laurence.
Thank you, Laurence.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Let me mention really quick that I print the cities he's going to be in the weekly calendar that I put out on Saturday night. So for anybody that wants to know, and I usually put a couple weeks in advance so you have an idea of where he's going. So there you go.
All right. So we are about 13 minutes short of an hour. So what would we like to how would we like to finish up the show? You want to bring up some news items or anything, or?
Let me bring up something we were talking about before we went on the air, and everybody kind of reacted to it. Paul played temporary secretary over the weekend for apparently the first time. And, I thought it was kind of, okay. I don't think it's earth shaking, but I did notice the one video that I published was he was having a ball with it, which was kind of cool. But I'm just wondering how you guys felt about it.
I think it's really interesting that he did it. I think it's something that nobody ever expected him to do live. A lot of people have sort of clamored for, but, tongue in cheek, because it was never expected he'd do it. Right. So I think it's really interesting that he added it to the set. I don't know if it will stay there or get rotated out, but, he has all of these songs that he's never performed. I mean, for a long time, he focused on Beatles songs he'd never performed. Remember when he started playing Fixing a Hole, his intro was that he'd never ever played it. But there's a ton of stuff from the solo period and songs people like, that he's never done. And it's good to see him sort of dusting off something like this and playing it.
I did see some comments from people that were not happy that he played it because they were saying, God, he could have played so many other songs and he picked that one. I mean, but I thought, and much as I don't particularly like the song, I thought they did a great job with it. And like I said, the video I saw, he was having a blast. So, that in itself was kind of fun.
And kind of apropos of what LJ was just talking about, it is kind of a goofy song, and it's never been particularly a favorite of mine, but it does, as is the case with other songs on McCartney too, it does kind of show the way in a sense toward the kind of electronic, synth based music that was very predominant, say, in the first half of the 80s. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of its time. Again, it's not a great song, but it is, when you think of it in those terms, in strictly musical terms, it's not, it's where it is in the McCartney chronology is not terribly out of place.
Well, my comment about this?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm absolutely thrilled to pieces. And in a way, why do you laugh, Steve?
Because I knew you would be thrilled to pieces.
This song, it really, in some ways, it's not even all that important whether I like it or not. I'm more thrilled at the fact that he's doing something he's never done live before. And it's not only a song he's never done live before, it's a song I would never expect him to do live. And, there's so many hits he's had in his solo career that he still hasn't done live. There's a lot of songs that I could hear him doing live that would work well live, that were album cuts that he's never done. I could see that ahead of Temporary Secretary. I actually really have always liked the song itself. I like the production behind it. I like the quirkiness of the song and that backwards, the synth loop that goes on and on.
Yeah.
And not only that, but one thing that's kind of frustrating when you see Paul live is that he runs that long video of his career, and he's got all this background music that he plays. And Temporary Secretary is always in there, and there's all these other songs from his career that he's never done live before. And I'm kind of thinking maybe this is how he gets by satisfying those fans who might want to hear those songs without him doing them live. There's a lot of songs, and he adds a dance mix to a lot of his music from different decades. And but Temporary Secretary, it's kind of interesting what Laurence said about McCartney too, that it's kind of being recognized a little bit now as being a bit ahead of its time, because I had just read an article online about this, and I saw one a few years ago too when the remaster came out for McCartney 2. I don't know if it's going to open up the whole world to that album, but it's nice to see that there are people out there in the media who are writing articles about that album and recognizing it and seeing that Paul was a little bit ahead of the curve at that moment. And so the music on that album reflects that. It's a very down home, kind of like the first McCartney album, only without the synthesizers. I mean, the first McCartney album didn't have synthesizers, but it's similar in that Paul plays all the instruments, and it's got that quirkiness to it that I like. I like when Paul gets quirky and does things that are, I shouldn't even call it out of character, because nothing surprises me what Paul can do. As Laurence just said, he could jump to different genres easily, within from one day to the next. It's just something that he's capable of doing. So, I'm just really happy that he's doing anything live that he hasn't done live before. There's an article that I just saw in the last few days where Paul's saying that, he doesn't mind if he makes mistakes on stage. He's relaxing a lot more. He's having fun. And the mere fact that during Temporary Secretary, he's supposed to be dancing on stage, he should be allowed to enjoy himself and, be as comfortable as he wants to be on stage and pick whatever songs he wants to do. Sure. So much of what he does on stage is, as he has put it, what he thinks his audience wants to hear. So, what about what he wants to do?
Sure.
There's got to be songs in his career that he's really proud of that were never hits, and he'd love to do them live, and he probably may never get to do them live because he's got to do those iconic songs from show to show. And if you read a lot of his interviews, he says kind of the same thing, that there are a lot of people who go to see him live that are seeing him for the first time.
Right.
And those people are going to be very disappointed if he doesn't do Hey Jude and Let It Be and Band on the Run. And those songs, there are certain iconic songs that you expect, especially if he's playing in arenas, that he's got to do live. So for him to do anything from his solo career, especially something that wasn't a hit and wasn't on his latest album, is surprising to me. And I welcome it with open arms. I wish he would do so much more of it. And I love reading how people comment to this online, whether it's on Facebook or the threads that I've read. One person said, Paul, just stick to the Beatles and your Wings stuff and you'll be all right. Nobody wants to hear your new stuff. And then one person said, this is so refreshing. Why doesn't he open up more and do more stuff like this? So you got different opinions no matter what, all over the world, of what they want Paul to do. And when you've got a catalog that enormous, my big dream, which probably will never happen, but you can never say never with Paul, is that he would do more dates, play smaller venues, and go deeper into his catalog. Because I think, the people who have bought all of his albums should matter, not just the casual fans or the ones that are now discovering the Beatles, who really know him for being a Beatle. So I'm thrilled that, he's picked this one. Anytime he's done any song live that he's never done live before, especially if it's not a Beatles song, he just started doing Another Girl. And I love the fact that he's doing it. It's a great song. I've always loved that song. It's a song that works well live, but it doesn't shock me that he's doing it. But this kind of thing would. So I'd love to see him do more songs like this, songs that weren't hits, even the hits that he's never done live before. Like we've mentioned here on this show, Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, he's never done live. Helen Wheels, he's never done live.
No More Lonely Nights, he's never done.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. Take It Away, he's never done live before. So there's a lot of them, actually. With a little luck, he's never done live. A number one hit like that. So I really am just very happy that he chose to do that one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's kind of, again, going back to what LJ was saying before about the fact that, if Paul were to basically stop touring right now, it wouldn't be like the situation in the 80s where he could just pick up and do it again in say 5 years, because in 5 years he's going to be in his late 70s. Right. So it's probably really more incumbent on him and Ringo as well to basically keep touring and and keep the chops fresh.
Right.
Yeah. But I in the same vein, I know there definitely are people who do see him, who still do see him for the first time. There's somebody who's going to be seeing him for the first time with me in Philadelphia, and there are obviously songs that would be a disappointment if they weren't there.
Right. How can you see Paul McCartney without him doing Hey Jude?
Exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Although the Wings Over America tour, he didn't do Hey Jude, and that was, I know he only did 5 Beatles songs in that tour.
Well, yeah, but that was when he was still basically just doing the Beatles songs as almost a concession.
Right.
And he was really, really more promoting Wings. But it is nice when he pulls out a little chestnut, even if it's not one of the hits, quote unquote.
Right. I'm sure that with you three guys, there's got to be a few songs from him, especially songs that weren't hits, that are favorites of yours, that you feel really deserve to be recognized as being, one of his best. I've talked about The End of the End before,
yes.
Which I think is, although I can't see him doing that.
No, I can't.
Because that's got to be a more intimate setting. But certainly in terms of lyrics, I think that's one of the best songs he's ever written. Only Love Remains,
exactly.
Which he's only done on a TV show once.
Yeah.
Something like that. Certainly when it comes to ballads and songs like Some Days and Beautiful Night and, songs like those. Definitely. I mean, we could be here for 10 hours talking about songs we'd love to see Paul do live that he's never done live before.
My point, the point I was going to make was that I'd love to see, if you assume that Temporary Secretary was one that he himself said, the heck with it, I'm putting this in because I want to put it in. I'd love to see a list of maybe, a few 5 or 6 songs that he would dig out of the catalog that he's never played that he would actually like to put in, irrespective of whether people want them or not. Just his personal favorites. I'd like to see what he would dig out.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes also some of these requests come from the band.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, yeah.
So,
when Rusty was on, he mentioned that there was a back and forth with the band.
Yeah.
So yeah. I'd love to see him do a personal favorites kind of thing, and I mean, I'm sure some of those songs are, but I mean, it'd be funny to see him get really deep into the catalog and just surprise the hell out of everybody. It would be fun. Anyway.
Well, yeah, but one thing that I really wish, along with what I just said, doing a tour of smaller venues and going deeper into the catalog, if he would just once do a concert where every song he did was a song he wanted to do and not care what the audience thought.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's not Paul to not care about the audience. So, but, have a moment of self-indulgence there, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And, showcase songs that you're really proud of that the average person doesn't know. And maybe even, if it's Beatles songs, sometimes people, they take a look at the songs that John did and think, well, Paul shouldn't do those. But if he loves those songs and he's proud of them, I'd love to hear him do something like Tomorrow Never Knows. He's proud of that song. You know, he's brought it up before. I remember Will Lee talking to Paul. It might have been during the concert for New York when he was talking about the Fab Four, you know, and the songs that they do live. And Paul said to him, really, you know, do you do Tomorrow Never Knows? Like, that's the song that he picks of all the, you know, Beatles songs. Like, he would be thrilled if they did Tomorrow Never Knows. So do something that you feel like doing. And, you know, it could be a George Harrison song. It could be a Ringo song. It could be anything. Do what you feel like just once. And I think the audience would get a big kick out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, along those lines, there's no reason that, I mean, if he's doing the songs that he did on Kisses on the Bottom and on the Russian album and things like that, that he shouldn't sing songs that John Lennon sang when he was in the band, you know?
Right.
Well,
he's done Strawberry Fields.
That's true.
And The Day in the Life, which they co-wrote.
Well, even a little Give Peace a Chance.
Right. And Help was in that medley, too. You know, and he just recently did Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, which Paul said he had a little bit to do with the writing of the song, but we know it mainly as a John song. Sure. So, you know, whatever he feels like doing. My God, you know, the man is now about to be 73. Let him do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
It would be far more interesting to me for him to just be himself, do whatever he feels like, instead of doing what everyone expects him to do.
Right.
He should do side one of Life with the Lions, let's face it.
This is the anniversary week. We should mention that.
Yes.
Well, you know, everybody ties together Life with the Lions with Back to the Egg.
Yes,
you know,
of course.
They think those two anniversaries at the same time.
They're linked forever in history.
There we go. There we go.
It's the medley of 2 minutes of silence and Spin It On. You know, we do it all the time on the radio.
Of course.
So I feel like George Burns saying, you know, say goodnight, Gracie.
Yes.
Well, let's just do that. Thanks so much to Laurence Juber for joining us. Again, his new CD is called Fingerboard Road. You can find out more about Laurence on his own website at laurencejuber.com. And anytime he wants to, he can join us here on this show. He's such a wonderful speaker.
Yes.
All right, so this has been a blast talking with Laurence and doing a little bit there talking about Paul and temporary secretary. All right, Paul. So, for things we said today, this is Ken Michaels being joined by Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, and Allan Kozinn. Thanking you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.